You know that feeling when you're standing in a store, could be Target, could be some random shop online at 11 p.m., and you've got something in your hand or in your cart, and it's like 40, 50, maybe $60, and you think, it's not that much, and you put it in the cart, or you click buy, and then you kind of forget about it almost immediately. And then the end of the month comes and you're staring at your bank account wondering where everything went. Like genuinely confused. You did the math in your head, your rent, your groceries, your subscriptions, and it still doesn't add up. There's just this missing chunk, a financial ghost, money that evaporated without leaving a trace. I think about that a lot, actually. More than is probably healthy, honestly. My name is Synth, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, financial psychology, and why some people seem to almost effortlessly accumulate wealth, while others, smart people, hard-working people, stay stuck in the same cycle for years, even decades. Not because they're irresponsible, not because they don't care, but because nobody ever showed them how wealthy people actually think about spending decisions, especially the small ones. And that's what today's really about. Because there's this rule, simple, almost annoyingly simple, that a surprising number of millionaires and genuinely wealthy people follow almost instinctively, and most people have never heard of it. Or if they have, they kind of brushed past it because it sounds almost too basic to matter. But here's the thing. The reason most people stay stuck financially isn't because they're making huge, catastrophic decisions. It's not the one big mistake. It's 1,000 small ones. Little purchases that feel inconsequential in the moment, but stack up into something massive over time. And this rule, the $50 rule, is specifically designed to interrupt that pattern, to put a tiny, almost invisible speed bump between impulse and action. And that tiny speed bump, it turns out, it changes everything. So stay with me here, because by the end of this, I think you're going to look at every purchase under $50 completely differently. And that shift, as small as it sounds, might be one of the most valuable financial perspective changes you'll ever make. Okay, so let's start with the actual problem, because I think we need to really sit with it before the solution makes sense. There's this thing that happens in our brains, and it's not a flaw, it's actually just how we're wired, where small numbers feel emotionally insignificant. Like psychologically, there's a massive difference in how we feel about spending $5,000 versus spending $50. $5,000 feels huge. It feels like a decision. It triggers caution, research, second-guessing, conversations with partners or friends. We sleep on it. We compare prices. $50? We barely register it as a purchase. We swipe the card or tap the phone and move on. And on some level, that makes total sense. $50 is objectively less than $5,000. But here's where the math gets quietly brutal. Let's say you make a handful of these small, unplanned purchases every week. Not even a lot, just a few. Maybe it's a random item from Amazon that showed up in your recommendations. Maybe it's an upgraded version of something you already had. A gadget, a book you'll never read, a piece of clothing that was on sale, so it felt responsible to buy it. Each one is like 30, 40, 50 bucks. Each one feels harmless. But 3 or 4 of those a week? You're talking about potentially $400 to $800 a month in spending that you barely even remember making. That's close to $10,000 a year, just vanishing into things that brought you a few minutes of satisfaction before becoming background noise in your apartment. And I think about this a lot because I used to be really bad at this. Not in a reckless way. I wasn't buying luxury items or going on shopping sprees. It was always reasonable stuff, useful stuff, things I could justify in the moment. But justification is not the same as wisdom, and I didn't understand that for a long time. The illusion of small money is one of the most expensive mental traps in personal finance, because wealthy people don't treat $50 like it doesn't count. They actually treat it with a kind of respect that most of us reserve for much larger sums. All right, so here it is, the actual rule. And I want you to resist the urge to think that's too simple when you hear it, because simple is not the same as easy, and it's definitely not the same as ineffective.
The $50 rule is this. For any unplanned purchase of $50 or more, you wait at least 24 to 48 hours before buying it. That's it. You don't automatically say no. You don't deprive yourself. You don't need a spreadsheet or a financial advisor. You just pause. You create a deliberate gap between the impulse and the action. Some versions of this rule use different thresholds. Some people say $100, some say $25, depending on their income level. But $50 is kind of the sweet spot where the math gets serious and the psychology kicks in most powerfully. It's high enough that it actually matters to your budget, but low enough that it captures the purchases most people are hemorrhaging money on without realizing it. Now, here's why this works on a psychological level, because it's not just about willpower, it's actually way more interesting than that. When you see something you want to buy, your brain floods with dopamine, not when you get the thing, when you see it and anticipate getting it. The purchase decision itself is an emotional event, not a rational one. And in that dopamine-flooded moment, you're not thinking about your savings goals or your credit card balance, or the fact that you already have 3 similar things at home. You're just feeling the pull of wanting. When you force a 24-48-hour pause, 2 things happen. First, the dopamine fades. The emotional charge around the item dissipates, and when you revisit the decision the next day, you're seeing it with a completely different part of your brain, a cooler, more analytical part that's much better at weighing actual value. Second, and this is the part I find genuinely fascinating, the majority of those purchases just disappear. Studies on impulse buying consistently show that a significant percentage of things people want to buy in the moment they don't actually want a day or 2 later. The desire was real, but it wasn't durable. It was situational. Wealthy people have internalized this instinctively. They're not necessarily more disciplined than anyone else in every area of their lives, but they've developed almost a reflex around spending decisions, a pause mechanism. And that reflex, multiplied over thousands of small decisions over years and decades, produces staggeringly different financial outcomes. Here's where I want to introduce something that I think genuinely changes the way you see money, and it's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in personal finance conversations. It's called opportunity cost. And most people kind of know the term, but they don't feel it in their gut the way wealthy people do. Every dollar you spend is not just that dollar, it's also everything that dollar could have become. When you spend $50 impulsively on something you didn't really need, you're not just losing $50, you're losing the future version of that $50. Let me make this concrete, because abstract finance talk tends to slide right off the brain. If you took $50 and invested it, and you did that consistently, let's say you found a way to redirect just $50 a week from impulse purchases into investments at a modest average annual return of 8%, in 30 years, you'd have roughly $350,000 from $50 a week that you basically weren't even noticing you were spending. And look, I'm not saying you should never buy anything spontaneous or enjoyable. Life would be grim and joyless, and that's not what this is about. But the question is whether that $50 item is bringing you $50, or ideally more than $50, worth of genuine, lasting value. And most of the time, honestly, it isn't. We know it isn't. We just don't pause long enough to admit it. Wealthy people are acutely, almost uncomfortably aware of opportunity cost. They see money not just as what it is, but as what it could become. That mental model fundamentally changes which purchases feel worth it. A random $40 gadget doesn't just cost $40 to them. It costs the compounded future value of $40, and suddenly the math looks different. Okay, so here's a practical layer on top of the rule, and this is the part that I think takes it from interesting to actually transformative. Wealthy people who follow some version of the $50 rule often pair it with what I'm going to call a running wants list. It's exactly what it sounds like, a running list. Could be in your phone notes app, could be a small notebook, could be a voice memo, whatever works for you, where you write down anything you want to buy that hits the threshold.
The item goes on the list.
And then after 48 hours, if you still want it, you go back and you look at the whole list together, not just the one item in isolation, but everything you've added recently. This is where it gets interesting, because suddenly you're not making individual purchase decisions, you're making priority decisions. Do you want the book more or the kitchen gadget more? Do you actually want either of them now that you're looking at them together a few days later? What on this list genuinely excites you still, and what was just a momentary flicker? This reframes spending from a series of isolated impulses into something that looks a lot more like intentional curation. You're not depriving yourself, you're just giving your preferences time to become more honest. And the other thing that happens, and I love this part, is that the list itself becomes a little psychological mirror. You start to see patterns. Maybe you notice that you keep adding things from a certain category, which might tell you something about an unmet need or a stress response. Maybe you notice that half the things you add disappear from the list within a day, which tells you they were never real wants to begin with. The list teaches you about yourself, and that self-knowledge is genuinely one of the most valuable financial tools you can have. This might be the most important section, so I want you to stay with me here, even if we're getting into territory that sounds a little more abstract. There's a reason this rule works long-term for some people and fails for others, and it's not discipline, it's identity. Here's what I mean. Most personal finance advice operates at the level of behavior. Do this, don't do that, track this number, automate that transfer. And behavior change works short-term. But behavior that isn't backed by identity tends to crumble under pressure. When you're stressed, when you're bored, when you've had a bad week, the behaviors fall apart because they were always a little bit forced. They were rules imposed on top of an identity that was still fundamentally that of an impulse spender. Wealthy people who genuinely maintain strong financial habits over decades aren't white-knuckling it. They don't experience the $50 rule as restriction. They experience it as expression. It's an expression of who they believe themselves to be, someone who is intentional with money, someone who values the future version of themselves, someone who doesn't let momentary emotions make long-term decisions. That's a fundamentally different relationship with money than most of us were raised with. And this matters because when the identity shifts, the behavior becomes self-sustaining. You don't need external accountability or a rigid system you're constantly fighting against. The pause before a purchase starts to feel natural, even satisfying, because it aligns with how you see yourself. The practical application of this is actually kind of simple, and it might sound a little bit cheesy, but I'm going to say it anyway because it works. Start thinking of yourself as someone who is thoughtful with money. Not cheap, not depriving yourself, thoughtful. Every time you invoke the $50 rule, you're being the kind of person you want to be with money. Every time you revisit your list and decide something doesn't make the cut, that's a small win, not a loss. You're building an identity, one decision at a time. I want to be honest with you here because I think oversimplifying this would do you a disservice. Wealthy people don't apply this rule rigidly to everything. They don't agonize over every small purchase or treat every $50 like it's a major financial decision. That kind of anxiety around money is its own problem. It makes life miserable, and it's not actually what financial intelligence looks like. The $50 rule is specifically about unplanned purchases, things that weren't on your radar, that you encountered and immediately felt pulled toward. Planned spending, things you've thought about, things that align with your values and your goals, that's different. That's not impulse, that's intention. Wealthy people tend to spend quite freely on things that are deeply aligned with what they value. They'll spend generously on experiences, on quality, on things that create real and lasting enjoyment. They don't agonize over spending in those areas because the decision was already made at the values level. They know what matters to them, and they fund it without guilt. The discipline is reserved for the unplanned stuff, the distractions, the momentary shiny objects, the purchases that are really just a way of managing a mood or filling a few minutes of boredom.
So the nuance here is this. The goal isn't to spend less across the board. The goal is to spend better. To redirect the money that's currently leaking out in small, forgettable ways toward things that actually enrich your life. When you do that consistently, you get this interesting double benefit. You save more money and you feel more satisfied with your purchases because the ones you make are genuinely chosen rather than reflexively grabbed. Okay, last big point before we wrap up, and this one kind of blew my mind when I first started thinking about it seriously. We talk a lot about compound interest when it comes to money. You invest early, the returns generate returns, and over time, small amounts become large amounts. It's the mathematical engine behind most serious wealth building. But there's a parallel version of compounding that happens with habits and mindset, and it's just as powerful. Every time you invoke the $50 rule, you're not just saving potentially $50. You're strengthening a neural pathway. You're making it slightly easier to pause next time. You're building evidence, actual lived evidence that you are someone who thinks before spending. And that evidence changes how you see yourself, which changes your behavior, which creates more evidence, which further reinforces the identity. This is compounding at the level of character, and it's slow and it's invisible for a while, just like financial compounding. But then, one day, you realize that impulse spending just doesn't have the same pull it used to, that you naturally pause, that you feel a little uncomfortable making unplanned purchases above a certain threshold, not because you're forcing yourself, but because that's just who you've become. And that person, that version of you, makes completely different financial decisions across the board, not just on $50 impulse buys, on every financial choice. The muscle you build with small decisions is the same muscle you use for big ones, and wealthy people know this. They're not just playing defense against small purchases, they're training themselves. So let's bring this all the way back down to something real for a second. You probably started watching this video either because you resonated with the feeling of money disappearing without a clear explanation, or because you're already on a financial journey and you're looking for an edge, something small but meaningful that can compound over time. And I hope this gave you that. The $50 rule, at its surface, sounds almost laughably simple. Wait 24 to 48 hours before making any unplanned purchase of $50 or more. Keep a running list, revisit with a cooler head. That's basically it. But underneath that simplicity is a whole philosophy about the relationship between impulse and intention, between who we are in a heated moment and who we want to be over the long arc of our financial lives. Wealthy people haven't discovered some secret about investing or some magical income stream that the rest of us don't have access to. More often than not, they've just built better relationships with small decisions. They've learned to treat every dollar with the kind of quiet respect that most of us only extend to large sums. And here's the thing I really want you to take away. This is not about deprivation. This is not about being rigid or anxious or turning every purchase into a moral event. It's about creating enough space between impulse and action that your real preferences, your considered, value-aligned, future-oriented preferences can actually show up and make the call. Because when you spend in alignment with what you genuinely value, two things happen simultaneously. Your savings grow, and your satisfaction with how you spend actually goes up too. That's not a trade-off. That's just what thoughtful spending looks like. So here's what I'd encourage you to try. For the next 30 days, just the next 30 days, put the rule into practice. Every unplanned purchase of $50 or more goes on the list. It waits 48 hours, and then you decide with a clear head. That's it, one small shift. And then you tell me, a month from now, how much is still on that list?
How much of it still feels urgent? How different does your bank account look? I think you already know the answer. You just needed a reason to believe it was worth trying.